Tamerlane, nomad wars, Russian conquerors, revolutions, Islam, modernized Islam, nationalism. I hope you have prepared pilaf and tea, because today we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, the history of Central Asia. Even 100 years ago, the names of the republics there that we are familiar with simply did not exist. And even when they appeared, it was easier for Ilf and Petrov in the 12 chairs to call the inhabitants of the region Khwarezm or Bukhara. Unfortunately, it will not be possible to go through the history of all peoples in detail at a time, so today, we will focus on the Uzbeks and Tajiks. Unfortunately, most people with a double-headed bird passport like mine, especially those who have not found the Soviet Union, often have difficulty distinguishing these two peoples from each other, despite the fact that there are enough differences, as well as conflicts and questions to each other. Just look at the degree of discussion under the video about Khwarezm, for example. What do Uzbek and Tajik history have in common, and why does this not make them one and the same people? How did modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan appear in general? Where did these two ethnonyms come from, and what did they mean? Hello everyone, I am Yeger Ziryanov, and you are on the Redrum channel, where we talk about the dead, about history. In the 13th century, the Mongols of Genghis Khan did what they knew best, effectively interrupted the ancient state tradition. On the territory of the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, but the people of the rich cities there did not go away, as well as dozens of steppe tribes. Descendants of the Polufsians, Oguzes, Naimans, Uihurs, and anyone else. All these people had no single community, and self-identification mainly took place according to the principle, we are the people of such a Khan, or the people of such a Ulis. For example, people from the Chagatai Ulis are Chagatai, Shibans from the Shiban Ulis, and so on. Be careful with these names in general. They have lived for a very long time, and have been transformed repeatedly. The Golden Horde, or Joki Ulis, in honor of one of the main commanders of the Shaker of the universe, became an independent state in the 13th century, rebranded in the 14th century, adopted Islam under the Uzbek Khan, and began to be called Uzbek Ulis, and in the 15th century, it broke up into a pack of independent states. In 1428th year, a Balkar, the ruler of one of them, the Ulis of Shiban, in the territory of modern central Kazakhstan, decided that this was not the case, declared himself an Uzbek Khan. But his kingdom, Uzbeks, and the tribes who swore allegiance to him are Uzbeks, although they often called themselves Dashabans. It was the Uzbeks who held on to two whales, Siberian fur trade, and constant internal strife. The fact is that there was no other unifying force other than the military, and it is not so easy for her to organize power over the nomads, because they, well, nomads, you know, can just take and leave. So to speak, to evade both the draft and the payment of taxes, and to do it in the literal sense of the word. And to the lords of the capital city of Chinjitura, modern Tumen, it remained only to wave high titles. When Luz Shiban collapsed after the Khan's death in 1468, a distant relative of the deceased took the throne in Chinjitur. These possessions would later turn into the Siberian Khanate, but a more interesting story happened to the steppes. There were tribes that did not recognize the authority of a Balkar. They were called Cossacks, something like a free adventurer, or a tramp in Turkic, or the one who throws a 20-sided die, if you know what I mean. In general, the steppes were given to two leaders of a couple of such nomadic hordes, which were originally called Uzbeks, residents of the Golden Horde. Then they became Uzbek Cossacks, and finally, by the 16th century, they acquired the name Kazakhs. Their opponents migrated to the Ural River. There, the Shibans had a new leader, Mohammad Shaybani, initially an ordinary warlord with several hundred warriors. There were about 1 million of such adventurers in the steppe, but Shaybani had two advantages. Firstly, he was charismatic, and secondly, he was the real heir of a Balkar, from the Shaybanid family, a descendant of Genghis Khan. People began to flock to the prince, and soon he had an army of several tens of thousands of people. And they were all called Uzbeks for old time's sake, and they also had to be kept and fed somewhere. And this funny way, by the way, helped to end the Tatar-Mongol yoke. At that time, Muscovites still did not collect, but paid Khan Akhmat from the big horde, the one who stood on the Ugra. When he started marching to Moscow in 1472 to beat the Breme with the unbridled Urus, Shaybani looked at the Middle Volga region, the lands of Akhmat, and thought that in general it was a great place to hang out with his many thousands of troops there. Akhmat had to hurry back from a barely begun campaign to Russia. He managed to expel Shebane, but this unsuccessful campaign of Akhmat is still considered by many historians as one of the factors that the yoke ended in Russia. When it didn't work out with the Volga region, Shebane decided to try Kazakhstan. It's also a great place in general, especially to feed your orda. But this time the Kazakhs kicked him out of there as well. Shebanina spat all this and led the horde where there was still left, that is, to the south, into the bowels of Central Asia, where various branches of Tamerlane's descendants fought for power. He began his offensive to the south, so that in the 1480s, they captured the city of Turkestan and made it their base. And he managed to fully establish control over the region only after 20 years. But by the time of his death, in 1510, Muhammad Shaybani was the ruler of Harizm, Bukhara, Samarkand, and the Fergana Valley. He chose Samarkand as his capital first, and then Bukhara. In general, all this is what I call an epic combo. For all his successes, Shaybani did not know one thing. He didn't know that in the future there would be a YouTube, on which I would be able to consistently and simply explain the difference between Sunnis and Shiites to you in one fairly short video. By the way, there is a link to it in the tips. And since he was worried about the descendants, thinking that it would be very difficult for them to understand, he decided to end any confusion on his own and declared war on the Shiite Safavid state. Persian. Shaybani sent the Shah a staff and sumo, hinting that he would soon become an unnecessary beggar. The Shah, in response, sent a spinning wheel and a spindle, hinting that soon a sexual act of a violent nature would be committed with the owner of Bukhara without a consent. And indeed, in 1510th year, the Persians surrounded Shaybani, killing the entire army of the latter. From the skull of the hapless conqueror, the Persian Shah made himself a cup. History is silent on whether he fulfilled his other threats. However, due to problems with the Turks on other borders, the Persian offensive almost did not continue. By the 1511th year, the borders were established approximately along the Amu Darya and calmed down. By the way, one of Shaybani's competitors in the region was Padishah Babur, repeatedly mentioned on this channel. After Shaybani's death, he will temporarily seize power, but he will not be able to hold it, having lost to Shaybani's relatives. And then, yes, he will retreat to Afghanistan, recruit troops there, buy Ottoman cannons, and then conquer most of India. This is how the retreat of Khan Akhmat from Moscow, in order to drive Khan Shaybani away from Sarai, will lead in half a century to the fact that the first of the Mughals will sit on the throne in Delhi. Meanwhile, the unification of the lands between Sir Darya and Amadarya Mogonara provoked a real migration of peoples. All the subordinate Shaybani and tribes began to flock there. Moreover, they are often called Uzbeks, but in fact, there were a variety of peoples there. Tatars, Nogay, and even some Bashkir clans. The migration stopped around the end of the 16th century, when different branches of the Ibanids created their own separate states. Karaz, Bukhara, and by the 18th century, from the latter, it is written as Kant. At the same time, approximately the power of the Shaybanids will change the direction of local clans from local tribes. From the point of view of legitimacy, all these khanates were based on two things, the legacy of Genghis Khan and Islam. And the further it went, the more Islam dominated. Well, because if the Shaybanids could still draw a direct line from the Mongol rulers, then it was already difficult to do it. For some kind of Mangit family that replaced them in Bukhara, although they tried. Islam is a completely different matter. Abul Khair declared himself a defender of Islam in distant Siberia. By the way, he really tried to cross himself there, although I'm not sure that the word cross is appropriate here. In general, it was not possible to make the Kanti and Mansi Muslims who lived there, but for some reason it was not possible. As a result, all Uzbek rulers accepted this idea and brought the Muslim clergy closer to themselves as much as possible. One of the Bukhara emirs even once proclaimed that if the Yasa, the law of Genghis Khan, diverges from the laws of Sharia, then well. This Yasa. Have you noticed, by the way, that I'm talking about religion and belonging to the genus of neonation? As you understand, this is simply because, despite the fact that there are disputes whether there were nations or something similar to them in the Middle Ages or not, we had a separate video about it. All these formations that we are talking about today were definitely not national states. And the questions of faith and belonging to a family or clan were definitely much more significant there than the questions of belonging to one or another nation. We call Harizm, Bukhara, and Kokand Uzbek Khanates. On Russian maps of the 18th century, all these states were called Uzbek possessions. Uzbek there, strictly speaking, was a small part of the Turkic population and the ruling dynasty. Even among the Turks of Bukhara and Khwarezm, Uzbeks were rather a minority. And all because those who came with the Shaybanids or their descendants were called Uzbeks. The same Turks who lived in these territories before the conquest called themselves Sarts or Chagatai. In fact, these peoples were mixed up both in terms of languages and in terms of settlement, especially in cities. So it was not so easy to draw a clear boundary between them. But in general, belonging to the estates could indicate who is in front of you. Lieutenant of the Orenburg Dragoon Regiment, Dmitry Gladyshev, who traveled to Khiva in 1740th year, aptly formulated that the Uzbeks are in the Khanate. These are the nobles and the serving people, that is, the ruling class, and the Sarts. These are merchants. Plus, many Uzbeks remain nomads, while the Sarts remain farmers. But in addition to these Turkic peoples, there were still non-Turks, mainly native speakers of other pagan languages, whose tribes were called the word Tajiks. The word itself, by the way, is not originally Turkic, of course, although some disputes on this topic are being conducted. Let's explain about non-Turks and why I emphasize the language. There were two main languages in all of these kingdoms. The first one is Chagatai, the ancestor of modern Uzbek, the Turkic language, which became, under the successors of Shaybani, almost the main language of literate people of Khiva, Bukhara, and Kokand. The second was Farsi, the official language in all those khanates, in which laws and decrees were written. In general, Farsi was then a global language for lands from Persia to India, and even in China, it was spoken by local Muslims. In Central Asia, Farsi remained the main language of urban life until the 20th century. Moreover, there was a high literary Farsi, and there was also a spoken language, which, the more transformed into modern Tajik. By the way, not without the help of the efforts of the Soviet government in the 20th century, but it does not matter. But because Farsi remained the language of culture, the difference between Uzbeks and Tajiks was often very subtle. In general, Western Bukhara was more Turkic-speaking, and Eastern Bukhara was Iranian-speaking. But this is what concerns rural areas, and in cities everything, of course, was mixed up, and the locals could speak, in general, any languages. So the term Tajik in Central Asia, for a very long time, acquired a modern meaning. It meant Iranian-speaking, not Turkic, and was also often used as a designation for Arctic foxes, officials and that is, urban intelligentsia, since its main language was, as a rule, Farsi. And of course, so called the local descendants of Iranian-speaking tribes and peoples. So, the Uzbeks are originally Turkic nomadic tribes who initially followed the Shaybanid clan. Tajiks are a predominantly sedentary and predominantly urban population with near-Iranian origin. Both of these entities began to share territories and language after the Mongol Empire crumbled in Central Asia, and some new states began to emerge on its fragments. Even in the mountains of eastern Bukhara, there were four-speaking tribes, and they are also considered Tajiks. And even then, in the interval between the 16th and 18th centuries, the Koral Kapak tribes moved to where they mostly live now, Yeld. At the moment, their republic, part of Uzbekistan. And, of course, there were Turkmen tribes with a strange status. They roamed somewhere in their crowd, and some of them were considered vassals of Khiva, sometimes Bukhara, but for the most part, the Turkmens were independent and regularly raided their settled neighbors. However, today we are not talking about these people. And here it should be specially noted that this is all just a very approximate description of what certain groups of the population were doing at that time in this region, because everything was extremely confusing, especially in the cities located on the Silk Road, where everything was simply mixed up like in a hellish blender, especially considering how often these cities changed hands. It is unclear how the national building would have developed if, in the 18th century, first the lands of the Kazakhs, and in the 19th century, the whole of Central Asia had not been part of the Russian Empire. We have already made a video about the big game between Russia and the UK, but in short, Russia came to Central Asia in many ways, with the idea of getting ahead of the British. Moreover, it turned out relatively peacefully with the Kazakhs. Joining Russia turned out to be an opportunity for many Khans to defend themselves from many aggressive neighbors. Khwarezm, aka Khiva, Kokand, and Bukhara. Three Uzbek Khanates were less fortunate. They were banally conquered, and, it seems, quite suddenly for all participants in the conflict. The culmination of the Russian conquests of the middle of the century was, of course, the raid of 1865th year, when the detachment of General Chernyov took Tashkent. It was all pure improvisation. When even the Minister of Internal Affairs, and the second man in the empire, Valuev, spoke like this: General Chernyov took Tashkent. No one knows why or why. In response to this, why Bukhara and Kokand fought with Russia, but not for any high considerations, but because they themselves had views of Tashkent. Bukhara was defeated and annexed. Kokand also kind of recognized vassalage, raised an uprising, he was defeated and also annexed. And on the way, Russia at the same time defeated Khiva, aka Koraz. So by 1876 year, the entire right bank of the Amu Darya was transferred to Russia. And the Karmi Oasis became a Russian protectorate. And already in the 80s, Russia conquered the Turkmen tribes under the pretext of protecting its new vassals. In 1884, Pomorf is the last independent city in the region. This, by the way, almost led to a war with Great Britain and what I talked about in the video about the big game. As a result, the whole of Central Asia was divided into 4 sections. In the north, the Kazakh lands were divided into provinces. Khiva and Bukhara in a truncated form remained as if independent states. But their monarchies officially became vassals of the Emperor of all Russia. And the rest of the territory became the Turkestan Governor-General with the center in Tashkent. In general, the name is interesting because initially, for centuries back in the 18th century, on Russian maps, this entire region was called the Great Tartary. Yes, this is a real term. It was not invented by schizoteracists, but it only meant that these were the former lands of Genghis Khan's empire. If anything, there was also a small Tartary, the so-called lands of the Crimean Khanate. But since the 19th century, the term Turkestan has been used, the country of the Turks. And there is a funny version that this country of the Turks was invented simply by some Russian officials, who did not understand when they saw the name of the city of Turkestan, deciding that, well, the camp. The country, the Turks, most of the peoples who live there, are Turkic sort of, yes. In general, the term has caught on. There is much to say about Russia's colonial policy in Turkestan, but we will focus on the fact that Russia has brought with it an intensified, accelerated westernization. Of course, Turkestan remained the poorest region of the empire, with rather archaic economic and not only relations, but even a railway. Raw material processing plants and so on were stretched here. But, of course, fresh ideas have caught up in local education. The result was quite predictable. The conquest of Turkestan ended in the early 1880s, and already about 20 years later, that is, literally in one generation, there was a movement of Jadids, that is, new people, who advocated the creation of a modern Muslim culture. It was an all-Russian Muslim movement that originated in the Turkic-speaking Tatarstan and Crimea. The Jadids saw Russia as an instrument of access to European instruments and institutions. It was a movement of Muslim reformers who advocated mass education, for the emancipation of women, and for the revision of relations between Sunnis and Shiites. In short, actually very cool guys. In the 20th century, these tough guys were influenced primarily by 2 events. The first one. This is the Russian-Japanese War. The fall of Port Arthur was for them the same sign that the capture of Singapore by Japan in the 42nd year would be for the freedom fighters of India. Before that, for the average resident of Tashkent, Khiva or Bukhara, the Russian Empire was, of course, a conqueror and an oppressor, but also such a Europe at home. Guys who, of course, have a whip, which you can't really compete with, but there is also a carrot. And now it has become clear that this idea is somewhat mythologized. After all, those invincible Russians of yours are being beaten by the same Asians. The second event was the Young Turk Revolution in Turkey, which was perceived as the elder sister of Turkestan, which is worth looking up to. Khiva and Bukhara even had their own political parties that copied the Young Turks, the Young Ukrainians and the Young Bukharians, respectively. Speaking of youth, for the most part, the Jadids were really very young people, about 1870s of birth. Does this mean that? This means that they did not find the old pre-colonial society, but almost everyone has already received an education. They tried to enter politics, but they were not very good at it for one simple reason, until the 17th year. They stupidly, in fact, did not have their own representation. In 1906, after the Duma elections, they agreed with the cadets to push through some Jadid ideas, but this is not very serious. But there the Jadids did not succeed much and focused on attempts to modernize society from within, for example, to organize secular schools. In 1917, about 100 Jadite schools operated in Turkestan, where 8,000 to 10,000 children studied. One of the first Uzbek-language newspapers was published in 1906. Taraki, development. By the way, it's interesting that the name of the newspaper was in Arabic. You can immediately see who the guys were guided by. In 1915 years, the history of Turkestan was published in the appendix to the Turkestan newspaper. But where there is a national press and a national history, there are all the foundations for the formation of national states and national identities. And with this, everything was quite interesting for the Jadids. They played for Turkestan. not for Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or Turkmenistan, but for a single civil nation from the Caspian Sea to the Hindu Kush, and from Aral to the border with Iran, and with the capital in Tashkent. And the project of Greater Turkestan also assumed the inclusion of the steppe region, that is, the current East Kazakhstan. By the way, on the basis of this project, Nazi Germany will then come up with the concept of the Reich Commissariat Turkestan, which, however, has never been implemented. But in general, the scale of the idea is quite understandable. Most of the leaders of the movement came from big cities where the population was already mixed. And it was not really felt what the problem could be here at all. Although the problems here, of course, are visible to the naked eye, because, at least, the common history, religion, and the Turkic language, for example, should have become the basis for this nation. And the Turkic language meant Uzbek. No, in general, there was a choice in the Jadika schools, to be honest. It was possible to learn Uzbek or Farsi, but Uzbek was still considered preferable. Firstly, because the Jadids focused on the Turkic world, on Kazan, and on Turkey. And Uzbek as the main language could well help to become a part of the Turkic world. And secondly, at that time it really was already the language of the majority of the population, and, most importantly, the language of the nascent bourgeoisie, which was mainly from the Uzbeks, from the Sarts. However, when the 17th year happened, and it came down to business, it turned out that none of this was important, because the Jadids were absolutely not ready for such a batch. In the beginning, everything was even good. In May of the 17th year, elections were held in Tashkent. And there the Jadite party took 2/3 of the mandates of the local Duma. October soon happened. These very Duma did not recognize the power of the Bolsheviks and declared the autonomy of Turkestan until, quote, a legitimate government is established in Russia. It turned out that the Jadid intellectuals did not bother to create a power wing, and the Bolsheviks simply dispersed the government of the Red Guard autonomy and established the power of the Soviets. It was no better in Khiva and Bukhara. There, the local rulers made perhaps the smartest decision when your state finds itself in the middle of a zone of chaos. They closed the borders and started pumping the army. In Khiva, at some point, the Turkmen leader Junaid Khan seized power, who established his dictatorship. And, of course, no young Bukharans, young Khivans and others turned out to be of no use to anyone. Even repressions with executions began. It suddenly became clear that here, as everywhere else, communists are participating in the civil war on the one hand. On the other hand, repulsed reactionaries and similar characters. And all sorts of centrist liberals, all sorts of intellectuals, and other moderate parties in this bloody meat grinder, in general, are not interesting to anyone. Then the young Bolsheviks and the young Bukharians decided to make a choice and supported the Bolsheviks. Well, because the Bolsheviks, after all, then seemed to be such radical progressives who were for modernization, the Republic, and, it seems, even for basic social rights. In other words, the Jadids still had more in common with them than with Junaid Khan and the mullahs. And then, the Reds seemed to be for the self-determination of peoples as well. Of course, the government of Soviet Turkestan was still mostly Russian. And other privileged immigrants from the European part of the empire, yes, Poles, Jews, Latvians, and so on. But all the same, the regional Muslim bureau of the Khiva was created there, headed by Kazakh Tarar Riskulev. Bukhara and Khiva even had their own communist parties, although in the snide remarks of Soviet intelligence. It was reported that, of course, these are not real communist parties, but just slightly more left-wing variations of the same Young Khivans and Vlad Bukharins. But the Reds didn't have much other allies in the region. If there were at least Russian Marxists in Tashkent, then in Bukhara and Khiva, it was necessary to rely on those who had to. Therefore, when their revolutions began in Khiva and Bukhara in 1920th year, the Red Army, led by Mikhail Frunze, quickly came to the aid of the rebels and, so to speak, brought freedom to the workers of the East on bayonets. On the 26th of April, 1920, the Kherson People's Soviet Republic was proclaimed, and on the 6th of October, the Bukhara National Socialist Republic. Frankly speaking, a significant part of the population did not accept this revolution, and in fact the occupation. A guerrilla war began, which is now known to us as the struggle against the Basmachi. Basmak is a Turkic word from the Red propaganda. It means a raider or a bandit. The rebels themselves called themselves a completely different word, mujahideen. And, by the way, this conveys the essence more precisely, because for the most part, it was the traditionalists who waged a holy war against the infidels and communists. But the construction of socialism in Central Asia was still launched. In both republics, everything was organized according to the Soviet model, although the Congresses of Soviets were called Kurultai, and the People's Commisses Nazirs. But in fact it was the same as in Russia, only the members of the local communist parties were in fact nationalists. For example, the chairman of the Council of People's Nazirs of Bukhara was Feyzullah Hayov, a character who could only appear at this time and in this place. The son of a millionaire, a dealer in doodle, who became a Bolshevik, an Uzbek nationalist, who lived in Moscow for a significant part of his life. Under Kojayev, the Uzbek language became the main language in Bukhara. School education, press and office work were transferred to it. So, at the time of the formation of the USSR in 1922nd year, Central Asia looked like this. Blaka Razom and Bukhara People's Soviet Republics. Like independent, but under full Soviet control. There were autonomous regions that were part of Russia, the Kyrgyz Republic and the USSR, that is, modern Kazakhstan, and the Turkestan Isar, which generally repeated the lands of the former Governor-General. So why, already in 1924 year, it was decided to radically redraw this entire map? Well, when the Bolsheviks took power, it turned out that the empire was ready to continue to crumble, including due to intraethnic problems. So, one way or another, we had to negotiate with national minorities. And I'm not even talking about the delimitation of Kazakhstan and Russia, although there were difficulties there too. For example, in the Ural province, now it is part of Kazakhstan. At least the Cossacks dominated the government. That is, ethnic Russians, and all the 20s, the region tried to secede from Kazakhstan and become part of Russia. There were also more global issues. Already in 1920, immediately after the Sovietization of the Khan of Bukhara, the same chairman of the Muspuro Riskulev proposed the following plan: to unite Turkestan, Khorasan, Bukhara, and possibly the Kyrgyz Republic of the USSR, that is, Kazakhstan, into a greater Soviet republic. He even suggested the name of the Turkic USSR because, according to Riskulev's absolutely chauvinistic opinion, all the peoples of Central Asia are Turks, which means there should be one single republic. Such is the Jadeite Turkestan under a red flag. Naturally, this republic should be independent, but allied to the USSR, and become such a bulwark for the promotion of red ideas further to the east. Well, the head of the Council of People's Commisses of Russia, Lenin, and Stalin, who was then People's Commissar for Nationalities, blasted this idea as bourgeois nationalist. I don't think they liked the idea of letting such a huge region out of their hands, just as hardly anyone liked Riskulev's idea of creating a government based on national quotas, most of which would go to the Turks. Moreover, the latter was also disliked by a decent number of local peoples, like the Turkmen or Kyrgyz, who had absolutely no intention of dissolving into the Turkic majority. In 1920th year, as part of the Turkestan USSR, a separate autonomy was created for the Karakalpaks, the Amudarya region. It will then become the Karakalpak Autonomous Region in the 24th year. Turkmens and Kyrgyz began to ask for their autonomy, but Moscow had its own plans. Turkestan, Khiva and Bukhara were to disappear, and in their place, there were to be locations on the principle of one people, one republic. Young Bukharans were offered a new project, the so-called Small Turkestan. Instead of one large and unified state for the whole of Central Asia, they were offered to create a large, albeit smaller, state of purely Uzbeks, by which, of course, the Isarts were meant. In general, yes, you understood correctly, modern Uzbekistan. On the one hand, this decision attracted the local elite to Moscow's side, and on the other hand, it greatly weakened the opposition of those who wanted to unite the Turkic world. Kojayev and other leaders of Bukhara agreed to this. They didn't lose anything. On the contrary, Uzbekistan was supposed to consist of Bukhara and the annexed territories of neighboring republics. In addition, the Union Center agreed that it would be Uzbekistan. That is, Sartov and other national minorities were officially recognized as part of a single Uzbek nation. In the census of the 26th year, there was not even such a category Sarts, they were rewritten by Uzbeks. The authorities of Khiva, aka Harazm, initially refused to join Uzbekistan. The local communists rightly believed that they would have to obey the new comrades, but somehow they didn't really want to. The funny thing is that Uzbekistan didn't really need Khiva either. Hajiv explained that the Khwarezm Aziz lives its own life, it has its own rules and traditions there. And it will be quite difficult to manage all this. But 3/4 of the population of Khiva, these were Uzbeks and Sarts, so Moscow ignored the other arguments. As a result, by the 24th year, we came to the following scheme. Instead of Bukhara and Kherez, the Turkmen USSR and the Uzbek USSR will be formed. Tajiks were proposed to allocate autonomy within Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Karakalpakstan should be made autonomous within Russia. At the same time, Karakalpakia eventually became an autonomous region as part of the Kazakh Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, as part of the USSR. Soviet federalism. Senseless and merciless. Well, when they started drawing borders, as always, in this case, there were a ton of problems. In the Uzbek USSR, it was most difficult with the Tajiks. At the insistence of the Uzbek authorities, only 3 regions of the so-called Eastern Bukhara were allocated for Tajik autonomy, where Tajiks made up the vast majority of the population. It was a remote mountain hole, where the capital had to be made a village called Dushanbe Bazaar, a bazaar on Mondays. However, it will then be upgraded to a more or less decent city, and called Stalinabad, the current Dushanbe. The problem was that, as I have already said, the Tajiks were predominantly urban, so out of 1,200,000 Tajiks, 553,000 people became residents of the autonomy. But Bukhara and Samarkand, cities in which the Tajik population was the majority, Iranian-speaking, by the way, became part of Uzbekistan. The first head of the Tajik autonomy even personally asked Comrade Stalin to transfer Bukhara or Samarkand to Tajikistan, in order to have at least a normal capital, but all these requests were ignored. In fact, it is very difficult to evaluate. On the one hand, there is every reason to believe that the Tajiks were treated quite unfairly. On the other hand, it is also not true to say that there were no justifications at all for the section that eventually occurred. Many Tajiks who lived in cities were bilinguals, and often did not even separate themselves from the Uzbek population. I think it should be understood that the main problem in this conflict, and now it is the division of borders. It is, of course, a conflict story, is that all this demarcation into different national states took place at the behest of the top. However, the main reason for the reluctance to give up large cities, of course, was the unwillingness of the Uzbek authorities to share the pumped infrastructure. Moreover, for Kochhayev and for the Bukhara communists, Bukhara and Samarkand were the historical capitals of their country, and no one was going to give them to Tajikistan anyway. At the same time, the composition of Tajikistan was included around the world. Well, simply because the tribes there were recognized by Tajik ethnographers. Although they spoke a different language, or rather a bunch of languages, although they were really an Iranian group. And there were elites with us, and not Sunnis like the rest of the Tajiks. Tashkent was lucky on the whole. The former capital of the Turkestan USSR was inhabited mainly by Uzbeks, so it was made the capital of Uzbekistan. Although initially the plan was to make it the capital of Kazakhstan in general, because of the abundance of Kazakh villages near the city. But the city of Osh, which was in exactly the same situation, the Uzbek enclave on Kyrgyz territory, was transferred to Kyrgyzstan. Well, just to strengthen an economically weak region. I'm not talking about the fact that enclaves appeared during the division of the Fergana Valley, when some villages, railway stations or something else with a population of one type turned out to be on the territory of another republic. There were a lot of such cases too, so this whole project of national demarcation only confused everything rather than simplified it. But nevertheless it was accepted. In 1925 year, the Uzbek and Turkmen USSR entered the USSR as union states. In the 29th year, Tajikistan received the union status. The Kazakh and Kyrgyz USSR were admitted to the union in the 36th. As Isaac Zelensky, chairman of the Central Asian Bureau in the PBC, formulated back in 1925 year, we drew the boundaries with an axe. It didn't work out very well with monoethnicity either. Perhaps, only Turkmenistan turned out to be quite homogeneous in terms of the result. According to the census of 1926 year, 8% of Tajiks lived in Uzbekistan, and 20% of Uzbeks lived in Tajikistan. In Kazakhstan, the titular nation made up something a little more than half of the population, and as a result of famine, Stalinist industrialization and so on, by the 39th year, there were about a third of Kazakhs in Kazakhstan. The most surprising thing is that the approach of first creating nation-states, and then waiting for universal education to create nations in them, in this case, plus or minus, even worked. The political nations of Uzbeks, Tajiks, Turkmens, Kazakhs and Kyrgyz exist quite well, although in many Central Asian countries, there are strong diasporas of neighboring states. On the other hand, the foundations for this identity were laid long ago. Yes, the Tajiks of the 18th century are, let's just say, not quite modern Tajiks, like the Uzbeks of the 15th century, not quite modern Uzbeks, like the Kazakhs of the 16th century, Russians, and anyone else, because, despite the connection of various long-existing ethnonyms by modern nations, these concepts are not interchangeable. And it is important to understand this. Nevertheless, the history of these proto-national communities, the forms of institutions, cultures and languages that have developed over the centuries are a solid foundation for a national constructor that crystallizes in the face of a common enemy. Yes, nothing brings up a local identity in the colonies, like the imposed power of the metropolis hanging from above. Thus, the development of the peoples of Bukhara, Khiva, like the Andes, and their becoming modern nations of Central Asia within the USSR is the merit of the totalitarian machine of the USSR, in the same sense in which the Dutch identity is a product of the policy of the Spanish Empire. The unification of disparate colonies into the United States is the merit of British colonialism, and so on. Unfortunately, it cannot be said that everything went smoothly. As is usually the case, diverse national building, multiplied by the controversial principles of drawing borders, have created a very fruitful ground for conflicts. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan regularly conflict from each other's enclave. The status of Karakalpakstan as a sovereign republic, which has recently ceased to be recognized as such in the constitution of Uzbekistan. The division of the Farkhad hydroelectric power plant between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Central Asia is fully experiencing problems that are familiar to many other former periphery of European empires. My team and I wish all of its republics to find problems to overcome successfully. And we also wish you to subscribe to this channel to follow future videos, and like this video if you liked it. And if you want to support us so that we work even better and more efficiently, then do not forget that we have Patreon and Busty, where holders of foreign and Russian cards can subscribe, respectively. Videos are released there earlier than on YouTube, they come out without integrative advertising. And you can still chat with us in our closed Telegram chat. By the way, are you subscribed to our Telegram channel? Is it even worth doing? In any case, do not forget to write your comments. What do you think about it all, and see you soon.